Hi, friend. Welcome to Rainy Tales, a quiet place for gentle stories told beneath the sound of rain. Now, let's begin tonight's story. Rain was falling the way it does when the world is half asleep, slow, steady, soft as breath. Through the window, the glass shimmered with beads of water, tiny rivers chasing each other down into the wooden frame. Inside the small room, a single lamp glowed like a captured sun, its light warming the corners where shadows curled. A pot of jasmine tea steamed quietly beside an open notebook, the scent floral and familiar, like calm after a long day. I sat by the window, my knees tucked under a blanket, watching the night breathe. The air hummed with the rhythm of the storm rain. On the roof, rain in the trees, rain whispering to itself in the distance. It wasn't a loud kind of rain, not the angry kind that comes with thunder and fear. This was the gentle sort, the kind that asks you to pause, to slow your pulse, to notice the heartbeat of the world outside your own chest. There was comfort in that repetition. Every drop was the same, yet different. Each sound found its own space, blending into a lullaby only the night could compose. I traced one line of raindrops down the glass with my fingertip. I thought how fragile it looked, how it broke and joined and broke again, never really gone, only changing shape. The lamp crackled faintly. I leaned closer to the window and saw the faint reflection of my face, a little older now, perhaps softer, though the eyes still carried the familiar restlessness of years, spent chasing things that ran faster than peace. There was always something missing, a letter unsent, a promise postponed, a voice I never called back. Outside, a tree swayed beneath the silver rain. Its branches were wide, strong, patient. I had seen that tree every evening from my window, its silhouette like an open hand cupping the moonlight. Tonight, under the drizzle, it seemed alive in a different way, breathing, listening. The wind brushed through its leaves, and for a fleeting second, I thought I heard a whisper. It was probably nothing, just the wind, the water, my own tired mind, but the sound lingered like an invitation. Maybe that's what solitude does when rain arrives. It opens small doors between what is real and what is imagined. I let it be. I poured another cup of tea, its warmth spreading through my palms. There was something about nights like this that made time feel softer, almost liquid. The ticking clock faded into the patter of rain. I felt my thoughts slow down, stretching out like ripples in a pond. My worries, the ones that usually crowded at the edges of my mind, seemed to dissolve into the sound of falling water. I thought of all the nights I'd stayed awake, trying to solve the small puzzles of life. Why some people leave too soon, why silence feels heavier than words, why patience feels so impossible when the heart wants to run. But tonight, I didn't want answers. I only wanted quiet. The rain deepened, a soft percussion against the world. Somewhere in the distance, a train passed a low hum swallowed by mist. I felt strangely comforted by its sound, knowing it carried someone home through the wet dark. I wondered if they too were thinking of warmth, of light, of someone waiting by a window. I turned off the lamp and let the room rest in half shadow. The rain became brighter in the dark, each drop catching a glint of reflected light from the street. It was beautiful in its ordinariness, this simple act of water meeting earth. And as I sat there, the tree outside shivered slightly, scattering droplets like small stars. I found myself whispering without meaning to just a few quiet words, more breath than voice. I'm still here. Maybe the tree heard, maybe it didn't, but I imagined it did. And in that small, imagined exchange, something inside me loosened. A knot that had been tied too long by hurry and noise. The rain kept falling. The tea grew cold. My eyes grew heavy. Somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, I thought I saw the tree lean just a little closer to the window, as if listening. And maybe, in its own patient way, it always had been. Outside, the world was washed clean. Inside, I felt almost the same. By the time morning came, the world was wrapped in silver mist. The rain hadn't stopped. It had simply changed its voice. Instead of the soft tapping on my window, it now whispered through the air like a secret being passed from leaf to leaf. The air smelled fresh, damp, and alive. I opened the window a little, just enough for the cool breeze to brush against my face, and for the sound of the rain to fill the quiet room. The lamp was still on from the night before, casting a weak, sleepy glow over the teacup I had forgotten to empty. Its surface had grown a thin film, and I smiled faintly at the small evidence of time passing without me noticing. That was the kind of morning. It was gentle, forgiving, and unhurried. My eyes drifted to the hill beyond the houses, where the old tree stood. Its crown was wrapped in fog, its trunk darkened by rain, yet somehow it seemed unchanged calm amid the blur of wind and water. Watching it always brought me a strange comfort, as though its stillness offered proof that patience wasn't weakness, but quiet strength. I thought back to something my old neighbor, Mrs. Harlan, once told me many years ago. She was the kind of woman who kept stories tucked behind her wrinkles, like folded notes waiting to be shared. One summer afternoon, when I was still new to the town, she had seen me sitting by the same window, restless and fidgeting. She brought me a jar of jam and said with a smile, "You know, that tree listens. If you ever need to talk, go there when it rains." At the time, I had laughed politely. The way you laugh when someone says something kind but unbelievable. But now, with years between then and now, I wasn't so sure it was just a story. Maybe it wasn't that the tree talked. Maybe it was that we only learn to listen when everything else falls quiet like in the rain. I put on my coat and boots, feeling the familiar weight of the wool around my shoulders. The umbrella leaned against the door, the same one I'd owned for years faded blue, the handle worn smooth from use. Outside, the air embraced me with a scent of wet soil and pine. The street glistened, puddles rippling as the rain continued its patient work. Each step toward the hill felt lighter than the last. The sound of the city dulled behind me, the rush of cars, the chatter of people, all replaced by the steady rhythm of falling drops and my own breathing. The path curved through a meadow of grass, bowing under the weight of the water. At its end stood the old tree, its branches stretching wide like arms that had learned to both hold and let go. For a moment, I simply stood there, listening. The rain fell through the leaves in thin silver threads, each drop hitting the earth with a soft thud. The tree was massive up close, its trunk rough and cracked, roots spilling into the soil like veins of memory. I touched the bark. It was cool, damp, and strangely alive beneath my fingertips. "Mrs. Harlan said you listened," I murmured, feeling slightly foolish. The tree said nothing, of course, but the silence it offered wasn't empty. It was full. Full of everything I hadn't said. Full of everything I didn't need to explain. The rain thickened for a moment, then eased again. I sat down at the base of the trunk, the umbrella propped beside me, and watched the world through the thin curtain of drizzle. A small bird hopped between roots, shaking water from its wings. Somewhere nearby, a stream hummed softly, invisible but sure. I let the minutes stretch into something softer than time. My breathing began to match the rhythm of the rain. I thought of how often I'd hurried through days, counting hours, measuring worth in what got done. Yet here, beneath this tree, nothing asked to be finished. The world wasn't waiting for me to move. It was asking me to stay still. I closed my eyes and leaned back against the trunk. The surface was firm, but yielding, like the shoulder of someone strong enough to hold silence. And maybe, just maybe, I heard something, a low murmur that wasn't wind, wasn't my own thought, but something between the two dots. It said nothing clear, only a feeling. Slow down. I smiled. Maybe that was all the message anyone needed. The rain went on falling. The world went on breathing. And in that quiet, I felt the restless part of me, the part that always reached for what wasn't yet here, begin to settle. Like a bird returning to its nest. I didn't know it then. But that was the first time the tree truly spoke to me. The next evening, the rain returned, softer this time, more like a lullaby than weather. I sat by the window again, tracing the droplets as they wandered down the glass. Somewhere in the distance, a faint rumble of thunder sighed and faded, too tired to make an entrance. The world seemed wrapped in velvet quiet, the kind that makes you whisper without knowing why. My thoughts drifted back to the old tree on the hill. I couldn't quite explain the pull it had on me. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe something deeper, a quiet recognition. In a way, it reminded me of the people I used to turn to when words failed. My grandmother, a few old friends, even the version of myself that once believed everything had an answer. The tree carried that same calm presence, the same patient gravity that makes you feel safe being small. I remembered the day I first heard about it, long before Mrs. Harlan ever mentioned it. It was a story told by the local children back when I had first moved to this town. They used to say the tree was ancient, older than the church bell, older even than the oldest house. They said if you whispered your worries into its bark, the rain would carry them away, and by the next morning, you'd wake feeling lighter. I had smiled at their innocence then, too busy with my grown-up concerns to believe in such things. But as I watched the rain slide down the window now, I wondered if the children were right in a way the rest of us had forgotten it. Perhaps it wasn't about magic or talking trees at all. Perhaps healing only ever begins when someone or something listens. The next day, I found myself walking toward the hill again. The umbrella swayed gently in my hand, its faded fabric glistening with dew. The path was familiar now, but no less beautiful. Puddles reflecting the pale sky, blades of grass shimmering like glass threads. The world seemed newly washed, and in that freshness was a kind of grace I hadn't noticed before. When I reached the tree, it greeted me with the same quiet strength. Water clung to its bark, shining in soft morning light. I placed my palm, it once more, and the cool surface sent a small tremor through me. Not fear, but recognition. "Do you really listen?" I asked softly, my breath misting in the air. "Or do I just need you to?" The rain answered first, tapping the leaves above me like small applause. Then, from deep within the trunk, I felt something like a hum, not sound, but vibration. A rhythm steady as a heartbeat. For a long moment, I thought it might be my imagination again, until the feeling shaped itself into words that weren't exactly heard, yet somehow understood. "Listening is not waiting to reply," the voice seemed to say. "It is waiting to understand." I froze, eyes wide, breath shallow. But there was no fear in me, only stillness. The sound, if it could be called that, faded into the rain. I sat down on the roots again, the umbrella resting beside me. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence. I let it stretch, soft and wide, wrapping around us both. A small memory stirred, my grandmother's garden after summer storms. I was maybe 8 or 9, standing barefoot in the mud, waiting for her to finish picking herbs. I'd always asked why she never hurried, why she just stood there looking at the sky even after the rain stopped. She had smiled and said, "Because the earth is still listening." Now, sitting under this old tree, those words came back to me, clear and true. The patience of the world, its quiet endurance had always been there, waiting for me to notice. A gust of wind shook the branches, showering me with tiny droplets that smelled of moss and old wood. I laughed, a small, surprised sound that startled even me. The rain eased, sunlight pressed through the clouds in pale ribbons, and the tree seemed to shimmer beneath it, ancient unmoving, yet deeply alive. "Thank you," I whispered, not sure who I was thanking, the rain, the tree, or the stillness that had finally found me. For the first time in months, maybe years, my heart felt quiet enough to listen back. That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt too large to fill. The world outside was still damp, silvered by moonlight. From my window, the old tree stood faintly outlined against the sky, a quiet sentinel keeping watch while everything else dreamed. I wondered if it ever rested, or if it simply existed, awake and listening, night after night. I made tea again, this time chamomile, its scent like soft honey and hay. The steam curled into the air, vanishing as gently as breath. I carried the cup to the window and sat cross-legged, watching mist gather on the glass. It was strange how quickly the tree had become a kind of companion, a quiet presence at the edge of my thoughts' dock as I sipped. I thought of all the things I'd said beneath its branches. Half-thoughts, small confessions, memories that had once felt too heavy to carry. Yet the tree had taken them all without question. It hadn't offered advice or comfort, only presence. And somehow, that was enough. I remembered the sound it made, that deep vibration beneath the bark, the words it didn't quite speak, that somehow left inside me. Listening is waiting to understand. The sentence had stayed with me all day, circling through my thoughts like a melody I couldn't forget. It reminded me of my father. He was a man of few words, not unkind, but quiet in a way I didn't understand when I was young. I used to think he didn't care, that his silence meant distance. But now, as I sat here with the tea cooling in my hands, I wondered if I'd been wrong. Maybe he was just listening in his own patient way, waiting for the right moment to understand what couldn't be said. That memory came softly, like the echo of an old film. A rainy afternoon, decades ago. I'd come home late from school, drenched and angry about something I couldn't even recall now. My father had sat by the window, repairing an old radio. I'd expected him to scold me. Instead, he'd simply handed me a towel and said, "Sit down. You'll warm up faster if you stop pacing." We had sat there together, the radio humming faintly between us, rain tapping the roof. I hadn't said a word, but somehow the silence had spoken for both of us. I didn't realize until much later that this, the act of staying, was his way of saying he cared. The tree, I thought, was the same. It didn't need to speak because its presence said enough. It didn't need to move to remind you it was alive. Some things heal you simply by staying where they are. Outside, the wind stirred again. The branches swayed gently, scattering a few lingering drops that caught the moonlight like glass beads. I could almost hear that quiet hum again, deep and low, blending with the sound of the night. Not words, but a feeling, something that filled the silence with meaning. I whispered, "Are you listening again?" and smiled at how foolish it sounded. But the truth was, speaking aloud didn't feel foolish anymore. The rain, the mist, the moonlight, they were all part of the same conversation now. One that required no answers, no explanations. Just being. I rested my hand against the window, palm to the glass, and let the quiet soak through me. I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't rushing toward tomorrow. I wasn't trapped in old regrets or what-ifs. I was here, in this small room, with the tree outside, and the soft echo of my father's patience lingering in the air. Eventually, I finished the tea, its warmth fading into me like a slow goodbye. The night deepened, and somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, I thought I saw the tree shimmer again, as if nodding to the stars. Maybe it was just my tired eyes, or maybe it was answering Dot either way. I slept well that night, Dot, and in my dream, the tree spoke again, not in words, but in the rustle of its leaves. Patience is not waiting for storms to end. It's learning to rest beneath them. When I woke, The dawn was already brushing light across the sky, and for the first time in a long while, I felt quietly understood. Morning arrived like a sigh, slow, cool, and silver. Dew gathered on the window ledge, trembling with the faintest breeze. I woke earlier than usual, not from noise, but from calm. The kind of quiet that feels complete, as if the world had finally remembered how to breathe. When I stepped outside, the air still smelled of rain, earth and pine, damp leaves, and something faintly sweet. The sky was pale gray, not gloomy, just soft, like a sheet freshly washed. I walked toward the hill without thinking much about it, only knowing that I wanted to see the tree again, to sit beneath it once more. The path was still wet, tiny streams running beside my boots. Sparrows darted between branches, shaking droplets from the bushes. Everything seemed new and old at once, the same landscape I had seen yesterday, yet somehow different, as if it too had listened to the rain and learned something. When I reached the top of the hill, the old tree greeted me with its familiar quiet. Its bark gleamed dark and wet, and the grass beneath it sparkled with moisture. I stood for a long while before speaking, letting the hush of the morning fill the spaces between us. "Good morning," I finally said. My voice sounded softer than I remembered. A few drops fell from the branches above, landing gently on my shoulder. I smiled. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I wanted to thank you for listening." There was no answer, of course, only the faint rustle of leaves, the murmur of a breeze sliding between them. Yet I felt something, a pulse, steady and patient, the same as before. It wasn't a reply. It was an acknowledgement. I sat down by the roots again. The soil was damp but warm, as though it still held the memory of rain. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. The world seemed wider when I stopped trying to control it. The sounds blended together. The birds, the wind, the distant sound of someone chopping wood far away. All of it became one steady rhythm, a kind of heartbeat that wasn't mine, but carried me along nonetheless. The tree stood above me, unmoving but not still. Its branches swayed just enough to remind me that being rooted didn't mean being trapped. It meant knowing where you belonged and growing from there. I used to think waiting meant doing nothing. I said quietly, tracing the grain of the bark beside me. But now I think it means trusting. Trusting that things will unfold when they're ready. A soft breeze brushed my cheek, like an old friend nodding in agreement. I thought of all the storms the tree must have endured. Years of thunder, lightning, wind that could have torn it apart. Yet here it stood, patient, open, alive. Maybe that was what patience truly was. Not stillness, but endurance with grace. The hum beneath the bark stirred again, faint but present, like a lullaby hummed from deep within the earth. I didn't try to make sense of it this time. I simply listened. Everything passes, the feeling said. Even the storm, even the ache. But roots remember how to stay. I nodded, though my eyes were wet. I think I understand. The clouds began to part then, pale sunlight spilling gently over the meadow. The raindrops clinging to the leaves caught the light, turning to tiny stars for one brief moment before slipping away. I watched them fall, one by one, and it felt like a promise that endings could be beautiful too. When I finally stood to leave, I rested my palm against the trunk. "I'll come back," I whispered, not because I need answers, but because I liked the quiet. The wind carried my words upward, scattering them through the branches. And maybe, just maybe, the tree understood that by the time I reached home. The kettle was whistling softly. I poured a cup of tea and sat by the window once more. Outside, the old tree was barely visible in the morning haze, but I knew it was there, patient, listening, waiting. The rain had ended, but its song stayed with me, in the way the air moved, in the way my heart felt slower steadier, kinder dot, and as I took the first sip of tea, I realized something simple and clear. That peace isn't something we find after the storm. It's something we learn to hold within it. Days passed, then weeks. The rain came and went, but I noticed that each time it returned, I felt less restless than before. The sound no longer brought melancholy. It brought rhythm, a reminder that life moves in cycles. Arrival, pause, departure, return. The tree on the hill became part of that rhythm, a fixed note in the melody of passing days. I began visiting more often, sometimes with an umbrella, sometimes without. Sometimes I'd bring tea in a flask and pour it into a small cup, letting the steam curl up through the damp air. Other times, I'd bring nothing at all and simply sit, watching the clouds drift and dissolve dot. It wasn't always peaceful. There were days when the world below the hill felt heavy again. News that a friend had moved away. Memories that surfaced when I wasn't ready. Letters I still hadn't written. But even then, when I sat under that vast crown of leaves, something in me softened. The noise inside quieted. I started noticing small things. The smell of wet bark. The way the soil stayed warm, even after the rain. The faint hum of insects sheltering beneath the roots. The world, it seemed, had never stopped speaking. I had simply forgotten how to listen. One evening, after a long walk, I found an old man standing by the tree. He looked about 70, maybe more. His back slightly bent, but his gaze clear. He held a small wooden cane, carved with symbols that looked like circles and waves. Beautiful, isn't it? He said without turning when he noticed me approach. Yes, I answered softly. It's peaceful. He nodded. I used to come here with my wife, he said. We'd sit under this tree and listen to the storms. She said the rain always carried messages. If you're patient enough, you'll hear what it means. I smiled, my chest tightening a little. Did you ever hear it? He chuckled, a sound like wind through dry leaves. Once or twice. Mostly it told me to stop talking and start waiting. He glanced at me, eyes twinkling. And you? Has it spoken to you yet? I hesitated, then nodded. In a way, yes. It taught me that patience isn't quiet because it has nothing to say. It's quiet because it trusts the words will come when they're meant to. The old man studied me for a moment, then smiled the kind of smile that doesn't need to be large to be kind. Then you've heard it properly, he said. Not everyone does. He began walking down the path slowly, his cane tapping the wet earth in rhythm. After a few steps, he looked back and added, when it storms again, come listen. That's when the tree speaks clearest. And then he was gone, his silhouette swallowed by mist. I stayed there until the light began to fade, thinking about what he said. The sky was turning violet, the rain returning in a thin veil, soft and even. I leaned my back against the trunk, letting the drops find my face. For a long while, there was nothing, just rain, breath, the rustle of branches. But then, beneath it all, I felt that familiar pulse again, deep in the heart of the tree. Every storm has a rhythm, it seemed to say, and every heart learns it in time. I closed my eyes and listened. The sound of rain became music, not noise. The wind turned into a voice without words, and for the first time, I didn't try to hold on to the moment. I just let it pass through me. The way the rain passed through branches, the way light passed through clouds. I understood then that peace wasn't something you built. It was something you remembered. When I finally opened my eyes, the rain had slowed, and the horizon glowed faintly with the last trace of sunset. The old tree stood still, its leaves trembling with silver. I pressed my hand against the trunk and whispered, "Thank you." The bark was cool, smooth under my palm. I imagined the roots spreading deep beneath me, anchoring the hill through every storm it had ever faced. And as I turned to leave, I thought I heard one last whisper, softer than rain, almost like a sigh. Patience grows where hearts choose to listen. I walked home under the drizzle, feeling lighter with every step. Behind me, the old tree stood quietly, its leaves shimmering in the dim light, a living reminder that even through storms, there is always someone, or something, listening. The days grew longer, the rains more infrequent. Summer arrived slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the calm that spring had left behind. The grass on the hills shimmered golden under the sun, yet the old tree still held its deep green dignity, its roots still drinking from the memory of storms. I began visiting less often, though not out of neglect. It was more that the lessons I'd found there had begun to live quietly inside me. I didn't need to go to the tree to hear it anymore. I could feel its presence even when I was walking through town, brewing tea, or watching rain ripple across puddles on the street. Still, some evenings, when clouds gathered and the air smelled of rain, I'd find myself climbing that familiar path again. The hill never changed much. Birds scattered from the branches as I approached, and the wind greeted me with the same gentle murmur. The old tree seemed to recognize me too. I would rest my hand on its trunk, feeling the cool, steady pulse beneath the bark. "I haven't forgotten," I would whisper. The world around me had shifted in small ways. People hurried less after storms. The cafe near my street began leaving out potted plants to collect rainwater. Children played barefoot again in the puddles. Maybe the tree's lessons weren't meant for me alone. Maybe quietness, once learned, ripples outward. One afternoon, I brought a notebook with me, not to write, but to listen. I sat beneath the tree and opened it on my lap, the blank pages fluttering in the breeze. It felt right, as if the paper were waiting for the sound of rain to leave its mark. The wind moved through the branches, and for a moment, I almost believed the tree leaned slightly toward me, curious about what I would do. "I used to think stories had to be told," I said softly, "but maybe some are just meant to be heard." The leaves rustled, and I smiled. I started writing then, not in sentences or structure, just fragments, moments, sounds, feelings. The way rain smells when it touches dust, the way light bends through wet glass, the silence after thunder. The words weren't for anyone else. They were just reminders, little anchors to the peace I'd learned to find God as I wrote. A drop of rain fell onto the page, smudging the ink. I watched it spread, blurring the words into something unreadable, but strangely beautiful. A quiet laugh escaped me. "You're right," I said aloud. "Some things aren't meant to last on paper." The rain grew steadier, cool and tender. I closed the notebook and let it rest on my knees, watching as the drops darkened the cover. The sound filled every space around me, wrapping the hill in a rhythm that felt familiar, patient, forgiving, alive. Then, deep within the hum of the storm, I heard that low vibration again, the tree's quiet voice, rising and falling with the rain. "The world speaks in its own time," it seemed to say. "We only need to slow enough to hear it." I breathed in, slow and full, the scent of rain and soil heavy in the air. It struck me how much of life is spent trying to rush toward something, understanding, completion, meaning, when all along, what we seek might already be whispering around us, just waiting for silence to make space. The storm deepened, then softened again, as all storms do. The tree swayed, shaking droplets from its branches like laughter. And for a long moment, I sat there, wet through, happy in a quiet I didn't want to leave. When the rain finally stopped, the air was washed clean and still. I gathered my notebook and stood. The hill sparkled in the last light of the day, and behind me, the tree stood proud and glistening, its bark gleaming like old bronze. I turned and bowed my head slightly, a farewell not of words but of gratitude. Until next rain, I whispered. The leaves rustled once, soft, approving, and the world felt lighter for it. By late summer, the rhythm of my days had slowed into something gentle, like a long exhale that never needed to end. The rain still came, though not as often. Small wandering showers that brushed the rooftops and vanished before evening. Each time, I found myself pausing whatever I was doing, just to listen. It had become a habit, or maybe a ritual, one that reminded me of the tree, of patience, of how stillness can speak louder than sound. The town, too, seemed to move differently in the wet months. People no longer rushed through the drizzle as they once did. I often saw neighbors standing beneath awnings, smiling as they spoke softly, watching the puddles form. Maybe I only imagined it, but it felt as though the rain had changed something in us all. A shared quiet that no one needed to name. One afternoon, the sky turned gray again, that soft color that means rain is near. I walked to the window, and through the haze, I could see the hill, the familiar silhouette of the old tree against the horizon. It looked the same as always, steady, dark, patient. Yet I felt a pull stronger than usual, as if it were calling me to come before the storm began. I didn't take an umbrella this time. The air was thick with that sweet, metallic scent that comes just before rain. I climbed the path slowly, my shoes brushing against the tall grass, the world around me humming with anticipation. The first drops fell just as I reached the top, warm, round, and scattered. Then, almost instantly, the rain deepened into a soft, rhythmic downpour. I sat beneath the tree, leaning my back against its trunk. The bark was cool, familiar. Water streamed down through the branches, dripping onto my hair and shoulders. But I didn't move. I let it happen. The rain wasn't punishment anymore. It was communion. The world blurred at the edges, everything softened by silver water. My eyes closed, and I listened. The rain had a way of erasing the unnecessary, the noise of thought, the ache of old regrets, the unfinished sentences that lived in my chest. In their place came space, and in that space, a kind of grace. After a while, I began to speak quietly, as if to an old friend. I used to be afraid of waiting, I said. Afraid of stillness, of not knowing what comes next. But you've taught me that waiting isn't emptiness. It's faith in disguise. The leaves rustled above, scattering a few drops that kissed my face. I laughed softly. You don't say much, I continued, but maybe that's why your words last longer. The hum beneath the bark stirred, faint and low, a pulse deep in the heart of the wood. I rested my hand on the trunk, and it felt as though I was touching something older than time. Patience is how love breathes, it seemed to whisper. Not through holding tight, but through standing still. My throat tightened. There was no sadness in it, only recognition, the kind that makes you smile and ache at once. I thought of all the moments I'd hurried through, people I hadn't truly listened to, places I'd left too soon, mornings I'd wished away. All the while, the world had been patient with me, waiting for me to slow down and finally notice. The rain began to ease, tapering into a delicate mist. The sky brightened, though the clouds still lingered, heavy with silver light. From this hill, I could see the town below, rooftops shining wet, smoke curling gently from chimneys. Life was happening everywhere, quietly, beautifully, without hurry. I stood and brushed the water from my coat. My notebook, damp from the rain, hung loosely in my hand. I didn't need to write anything down. I already knew what I wanted to remember. Before leaving, I turned to the tree one last time. Thank you, I said, for listening and for teaching me how. The leaves stirred once, the faintest sound like the exhale of an old friend. And in that moment, I understood. It had never been the tree that changed me. It had only reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that peace begins the moment We stop trying to control the storm and start trusting the rain. The wind shifted, cool and clean, brushing my face as I walked back down the hill. Behind me, the old tree stood steady in the mist, not as a keeper of secrets, but as a companion to all who have ever waded through the rain and learned to listen. Autumn crept in quietly, the way a sigh settles into a room after a long conversation. The days shortened, the air cooled, and the rain returned with a different voice, softer, slower, as though it too had grown tired of rushing. The leaves on the hill turned amber and gold, and the old tree, steadfast and unmoving, stood at the center of it all like a keeper of seasons. From my window, I could see it changing, its canopy thinning, the branches showing more of their age. Yet it didn't look weak. If anything, it looked wiser, more certain of its place in the world. The kind of certainty that doesn't come from strength, but from surrender. I hadn't been to the hill in some weeks. Life had called me elsewhere. Small tasks, long days, moments that filled the calendar, but not the soul. Still, every night when the rain began to fall, my mind wandered back to the tree. I could almost hear its steady hum, patient and kind, waiting in silence as it always had. One morning, when the air smelled of smoke and the first frost dusted the grass, I decided to visit again. The path was familiar, though the colors around it had changed. Everything brushed in shades of rust, copper, and gray. The world felt like an old photograph, quiet and full of memory dot when I reached the hill. I found the tree just as I had left it, though its leaves now carpeted the ground in golden circles. The branches reached wide and bare toward the pale sky, trembling faintly in the wind. For a moment, I stood still, unsure of what to say. "Hello again," I murmured. "You've weathered another season." The air was cold enough that my breath came in small clouds. I sat at the base of the trunk, wrapping my coat tighter, feeling the damp earth press through the fabric. The bark against my back was rough. Familiar Dot, it felt strange to realize how much time had passed since that first night of rain. How different I had been then. Restless and heavy, searching for meaning in everything. Now I didn't need to search. I could just sit, listen, and be. A gust of wind swept across the hill, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and rain. The branches above groaned softly, and in that sound, I heard something almost like a sigh, not sadness, but age, wisdom, maybe even gratitude. I spoke quietly, unsure if the words were for the tree or myself. "You once told me that patience grows where hearts choose to listen. I think I understand now. It's not about waiting for things to happen. It's about trusting what's already here." The leaves rustled, swirling around me like gentle applause. I thought of the people in my life, the ones who had come and gone, the ones who had stayed. I thought of the moments I used to rush through, and the ones I had finally learned to linger in. There was beauty in all of it, in the growing, the fading, the staying. The tree had taught me that no part of the cycle is wasted. The rain began again, light as breath, threading through the cold air in delicate strands. I tilted my head back and let it fall across my face. The drops were icy, but they carried warmth all the same. The warmth of recognition, of something that never truly leaves. For a long time, I said nothing. I simply listened to the rain, the wind, the quiet between. The kind of listening that doesn't ask for answers, Dot, then, as if from deep inside the earth. I felt the tree's voice again, faint, barely a whisper, but clear enough to fill the silence. "Every season listens differently," it said. "Summer hears with joy. Autumn hears with memory. Winter hears with stillness. And spring hears with hope. But all are listening." I smiled through the rain. "And what about us?" I asked softly. There was a pause, then a tender reply. "You're learning to hear again." Something in me loosened, Not sadness, not joy, just release. A soft acceptance that things would keep changing, and that I would change with them. The rain thickened, and the hill blurred at the edges. I stayed a little longer, watching the drops weave silver paths through fallen leaves. Then, as the light dimmed, I whispered goodbye and began my slow walk home. Behind me, the old tree stood still, rain cascading down its branches. It didn't wave or call out or move. It didn't need to. It had already said everything it ever needed to say. And in the quiet that followed, I realized that sometimes the truest kind of listening isn't between two voices, but between a heart and the world that holds it. Winter came softly that year, not with blizzards or harsh winds, but with a calm that seemed to hush even the sound of breath. The rain turned to mist most mornings, and by night, a thin frost glimmered along rooftops like powdered glass. The air carried that faint scent of wood smoke, the smell of people choosing warmth, of fires humming quietly behind closed doors. From my window, I could still see the hill. The old tree stood bare now, its branches etched against the pale sky, dark and skeletal, but not dead. There was something beautiful in its stillness, a beauty that didn't need flowers or leaves to prove its life. I found comfort in that, perhaps because I too had been learning what it meant to live quietly, without display. One afternoon, as snow began to fall, soft, reluctant flakes, I decided to visit once more. I wrapped myself in my thickest coat and scarf, tucked a thermos of tea into my bag, and began the slow walk toward the hill. The world was almost silent, the sound of my boots crunching through thin snow, the only rhythm that remained. When I reached the tree, it looked different yet familiar, its bark dusted with white, its roots half buried under frost. The wind moved gently through its branches, making the smallest music. I brushed the snow from the roots and sat down, uncapping the thermos. Steam rose into the cold, curling like breath. "Hello, old friend," I said, my voice breaking the still air. "You look peaceful." The tree didn't answer, not this time, not in the way it once had. But I didn't mind. I had come to understand that silence, too, was a form of conversation. I poured a cup of tea, watching the vapor vanish almost instantly into the chill. For a while, I said nothing. I just looked out over the town below, rooftops lined with snow, thin trails of smoke rising into the pale sky. Everything was quieter now, slower. Even the river seemed to move more thoughtfully beneath its thin sheet of ice. I wrapped my hands around the cup, letting the warmth sink into my skin. "You know," I said softly, "I used to think peace was something you had to chase, like a bird that would only land if you stood perfectly still. But I think it's the other way around. I think peace is always here. It's us who finally slow down enough to notice." A flake of snow landed on my sleeve, melted and disappeared. I thought of the first time I had sat beneath this tree, that rainy night, so many months ago. I'd been restless then, searching for meaning in every sound. I had come hoping to hear something that would fix the noise inside me. And maybe I had. But what the tree had truly given me wasn't answers. It was permission to stop trying so hard, to simply be. I leaned back, letting my head rest against the trunk. The wood was cold, but solid. I could feel its heartbeat faintly, deep and slow, pulsing through the frozen earth. And then, in that quiet, something stirred, not words, but a presence. A warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. The same feeling that had met me through every season, every visit. The feeling of being gently, fully understood. Everything rests now. The voice seemed to hum, though no sound escaped the bark. Even the storms must sleep. I closed my eyes, smiling. Then I'll rest too. The snow thickened, drifting in wide, lazy flakes. Time dissolved in the stillness. There was no rush, No destination, only the moment, breathing softly between the falling snow and the steady heart of the earth. When I finally stood to leave, the thermos was empty, my fingers numb but warm at the core. I brushed the frost from my coat and looked back at the tree. Its bare branches reached upward, stark and patient, each one holding a thin crown of snow. "I'll see you when it rains again," I whispered. A breeze lifted a handful of snowflakes into the air, swirling them gently around me before letting them fall. It felt like a farewell, or perhaps a blessing dot as I walked back down the hill. The world around me seemed wrapped in soft white silence, the kind that doesn't erase sound, but makes space for it. The kind of silence that listens. And though the tree disappeared behind the curve of the hill, I could still feel it, steady, present, waiting. The kind of waiting that isn't lonely. The kind that knows spring will come. By the time spring returned, the rain had found its voice again. It came in long silver threads that shimmered under the morning light, tapping softly against the window as though reminding the world to wait gently. The air smelled new, a mix of wet earth, young leaves, and the faint sweetness of blossoms just beginning to open. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed that sound. After months of snow and silence, the rain felt like an old friend knocking at the door, bringing news of life's quiet persistence. I opened the window and let the cool air sweep in. It carried the hum of distant thunder and the murmur of running water, a language I now understood without needing to translate. When I looked up toward the hill, I saw it at once. The old tree had changed again. Tiny green buds dotted its branches like small lanterns, each one trembling with rain. I smiled, feeling a familiar pull in my chest. There was no decision to make. My feet already knew the way. The walk was easier this time. The path, damp but soft, curved gently through wildflowers that had begun to push through the soil. Birds darted between puddles, shaking droplets from their feathers. The world was busy again, but not in a hurry. Everything seemed to move with purpose, yet grace. When I reached the tree, I stopped for a long moment, simply taking it in. It looked older, yes, but also renewed. Its bark, darkened by rain, gleamed like polished stone. The branches stretched wider now, each one carrying a quiet joy. I placed my hand on the trunk, and it was warm beneath the damp surface, as though life itself had returned to flow inside it. "Hello, old one," I whispered. "You made it through another winter." A soft breeze moved through the branches, and for a heartbeat, I could have sworn I heard laughter. Not the kind made by people, but the kind the world makes when it begins again. I sat at the base of the trunk, letting the rain soak into my coat. The sound filled every inch of silence, steady, kind, familiar. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. The air tasted of beginnings. "I used to think patience was about waiting," I said quietly. "But maybe it's really about trusting that what's meant to live will." The leaves rustled, answering in their wordless way. And then, faintly from deep within, came that low hum, softer now, gentler, as if the tree no longer needed to speak loudly to be heard. "You've learned the rhythm," it seemed to say. "Now live by it." I let the message settle in, like rain soaking into soil. When I opened my eyes again, the storm had lightened into a fine drizzle. Sunlight broke through the clouds in golden ribbons, turning each drop into a bead of fire. The tree shimmered, its leaves gleaming like 1,000 tiny mirrors. For a moment, it didn't look like a tree at all. It looked like time itself, standing still just long enough to be seen. I took out my notebook, the same one that had been blurred by rain last summer. Its pages were warped and soft at the edges, but they smelled faintly of petrichor and ink. I wrote a single sentence across a clean page. "The rain doesn't rush, and yet it always arrives." Then I closed the book. Some truths, I thought, don't need to be explained, only remembered. Before leaving, I pressed my palm to the trunk one last time. The bark was rough, but beneath it, I felt something steady. A heartbeat, maybe mine, maybe the world's. "Thank you," I said, "for teaching me to stay." The rain began to fade, replaced by the soft chatter of birds returning to their branches. I turned toward home, walking slowly, letting the sound of my footsteps mix with the dripping leaves. Behind me, the old tree stood tall, its roots deep and strong, its branches open to the sky. And as I descended the hill, a single drop of rain rolled down my sleeve and into my palm. It sparkled once, then vanished, a reminder that even endings are just transformations, not disappearances. In that moment, I understood what the tree had been teaching me all along. That peace isn't something we wait for after the storm, but something that learns to live inside us, quiet, steady, patient, like roots drinking from the rain. By early summer, the world was wide awake again. The days stretched long and golden, the air thick with the hum of bees and the scent of wet grass. The rain still visited often, but it no longer carried the chill of loneliness, only the music of life in full bloom. I began leaving my window open at night so I could fall asleep to its soft percussion, the same way one might drift off to a lullaby. The hill had become my quiet refuge, not a place of searching anymore, but of return. Whenever life grew too fast, too loud, I'd walk there with a thermos of tea, knowing the old tree would be waiting, as it always was. I had stopped expecting it to speak. It didn't need to. The silence between us said everything. That afternoon, the sky was a deep gray blue, heavy with the promise of another gentle storm. I walked the familiar path, each step sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air was warm, but the wind carried a softness that hinted at rain. When I reached the top, the first drops had already begun to fall, slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The old tree was magnificent under the rain. Its leaves gleamed like glass, each one catching a droplet before letting it go. The roots beneath my feet were cool and smooth, alive with the pulse of the earth. I sat down, back against the trunk, the rain drumming above like the heartbeat of something ancient dark. It was strange how different this same place could feel with each visit. Sometimes it was a sanctuary, sometimes a mirror. Today, it felt like home, not because it offered answers, but because it asked for nothing. I poured myself a cup of tea, steam curling into the damp air. The scent of jasmine mixed with the smell of wet soil and distant thunder. I thought about how far I'd come since that first night. The restlessness, the sleepless hours, the longing to be understood. It all felt so distant now, like a dream that had finally exhaled. I spoke softly, more to the air than to the tree. You were right. The storms never really stop. They just change shape. But I've learned how to breathe through them. For a while, there was only rain. Then, almost imperceptibly, the hum returned. That deep, wordless vibration that seemed to come from the roots themselves. It wasn't as clear as before, more like a memory echoing back. The rain doesn't ask for the sun to stay, it seemed to say. It learns to shine in its own way. I smiled. The rain slid down my face, and I didn't wipe it away. It felt right to let it fall, to let the world touch me without resistance. Around me, everything shimmered. The grass, the sky, even the small stones by the roots. And in that shimmer, I could feel it. Life, endless and patient, flowing through everything. The same life that kept the tree standing, that carried the rain, that moved through me. I thought of all the people who might be standing under their own storms right now, waiting, hurting, hoping. Maybe they, too, would one day find a quiet hill and an old tree that listened. Or maybe they'd simply find silence long enough to hear themselves. Either way, they would learn. The rain began to ease. Sunlight slipped through the thinning clouds, scattering into 1,000 golden fragments. For a moment, the world looked washed clean, reborn. I stood slowly, feeling the wet earth cling to my shoes. I turned to the tree one last time before leaving. "You've been a good teacher," I said, "even when you said nothing." The branches swayed gently in reply, and maybe I imagined it, but for an instant, I thought I saw the faintest glimmer at its core, as though the tree itself held a light that didn't come from the sundial. As I walked back down the hill, the rain stopped completely. The air was cool and fragrant, filled with the hum of insects and the chirping of unseen birds. Each step felt lighter than the one before got by the time I reached home. The clouds had cleared entirely, leaving behind a sky the color of soft blue silk. I sat by the window, the same one where it had all begun, and watched the evening gather its calm. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, not a threat, but a promise. A reminder that even after peace, the rain would return, and I would welcome it. Because now I understood, storms were never the enemy. They were the voice of the world, reminding us to slow down and listen. I poured myself another cup of tea, raised it toward the hill, and whispered, "Until next time." Late in the season, when the days began to shorten again and the air tasted faintly of rain and wood smoke, I found myself walking to the hill without meaning to. It was one of those evenings that carried no plan, just instinct, when the heart moves first and the mind quietly follows. The sky was low and heavy, brushed with streaks of violet, the kind of sky that makes you remember things you didn't know you'd forgotten. As I walked, the first drops began to fall. They were light, almost hesitant, but sure enough to turn the earth dark beneath my feet. The air smelled like old leaves and rain-soaked bark. I thought of how many storms this path had seen, how many times I'd taken this same walk, sometimes restless, sometimes hopeful, sometimes simply quiet. When the tree came into view, I stopped. It looked unchanged, yet I felt something different. Maybe it was me. Maybe the world had simply caught up to my stillness. The branches swayed slowly, their tips trembling under the drizzle. Beneath them, the roots spread wide, old, wise, unafraid. I sat down, pulling my coat tighter around me. The rain fell steadily, drumming against the leaves in a sound that had become as familiar as breath. I leaned back against the trunk, eyes closed, and listened. It was the same rhythm I had heard all along, the same whisper that had once taught me how to be patient, how to wait, how to hear. But tonight, the silence between us carried a new kind of weight, not sadness, but something like farewell. The hum came again, faint and low, threading through the rain like a second heartbeat. I smiled before the words even formed. All things learn to let go, it said. Even roots. I swallowed gently, the words settling deep. Are you saying goodbye? I whispered. The wind brushed my cheek, soft as a hand. Not goodbye, only change. I understood. I had always known that nothing, not even peace, was meant to stay still. The tree had taught me that patience wasn't about holding on forever. It was about knowing when to release. I'll still come when it rains, I said. Even if you don't answer. A rustle above, quiet but certain. I'll always be here. Just listen. The rain thickened for a moment, blurring the edges of the hill. Every drop felt alive, like the world breathing around me. And in that breath, I could hear everything the tree had ever said, and everything it hadn't. The lessons were all there, woven through the rhythm of the storm. How to wait without fear, how to be still without emptiness, how to love without needing to keep. A flash of lightning lit the sky, distant but bright. For a heartbeat, the tree glowed white against the dark, vast, silent, timeless. When the thunder followed, it wasn't loud. It sounded like a sigh, deep and kind, echoing through the valley. I closed my eyes and pressed my hand to the trunk one last time. The bark was slick and cool beneath my palm, and beneath that, I could still feel the slow, patient thrum of life. "Thank you," I said, though the words were barely a breath. "Go on," the whisper came, lighter now. "The rain will walk with you." And then it was gone. Not the rain, not the hum, not the tree, but the sense of needing to stay. When I opened my eyes, the storm was easing. The sky was still gray, but the clouds had begun to break at the edges. A single beam of light slipped through, catching the drops as they fell, turning them into tiny falling stars. I stood slowly, looking one last time at the tree, its branches heavy with rain, its roots deep and sure. There was no sadness in leaving, only peace, because I knew now I didn't need to come here to listen anymore. The world itself had learned to speak, and I had learned to hear it back as I walked back down the hill. The rain followed me, soft and steady. The path shimmered, and the air glowed faintly with twilight. Every drop that touched my skin felt like a memory of silence, of patience, of gratitude. By the time I reached home, the storm had ended. The window was waiting, the lamp still warm, the same cup resting on the table. I sat beside it, listening to the distant echo of rain on the roof. It was quieter now, but I could still hear it. The tree's voice, carried in the rhythm of falling water dot, and in that sound, I realized something simple and vast, that maybe the world had been listening to me all along. The following weeks passed in a kind of golden quiet. The rain came less often now, as if the world had said all it needed to say for a while. Days stretched warm and slow. Evenings melted into lavender skies. From my window, the hill glowed soft under the light. The old tree, no longer a dark silhouette against gray, but a living shape against the sun, leaves shimmering like whispers of green glass. I still found myself pausing at the window each morning, half expecting to hear that familiar hum through the rain. But there was no sadness in the absence, only gratitude. The lessons the tree had given me had rooted themselves deep inside, the way sunlight lingers even after clouds move on. Life, too, began to fill again. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months stopped by to share tea. I began writing more, not about the storms or the tree, but about the small moments that had grown out of them, the laughter that returns after silence, the joy of slow mornings, the tenderness of ordinary things. I wrote not to capture meaning, but to notice it. Sometimes, as I wrote, I'd look up and imagine the tree still listening, its presence stretching far beyond the hill, through the air, through the rain, through everything quiet enough to hold it. One late afternoon, as thunder grumbled faintly in the distance, I decided to visit again, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. The sky was painted in soft gray, the kind of light that makes the world look timeless. I took the familiar path up the hill, the air thick with the scent of warm rain and earth ready to breathe again. The first drops fell halfway up, tiny cool kisses on my face. By the time I reached the top, the drizzle had turned to a fine mist. The tree greeted me as it always did, silent, patient, alive. Its bark was streaked dark from old rains, but new shoots were sprouting along the roots, small and brave. I smiled. "You're growing again." The breeze moved through the branches, gentle as laughter. I sat beneath it, closing my eyes, feeling the mist settle on my skin. The world around me hummed softly, not a sound I could name, but one I had come to recognize. The sound of everything being exactly as it should be. I thought of the storms we had shared, the wild nights, the calm mornings, the long silences in between. I thought of how much I had changed, and how much had stayed the same. I no longer sought the tree for answers. I came now simply to listen, not for words, but for presence. I whispered, "Do you still hear me?" The rain answered first, light against the leaves. Then, from somewhere deep below, came the faintest vibration, the kind that feels more than sounds. Always, it said that something inside me eased, like a door that had been left ajar for too long, finally closing softly. I let the stillness wrap around me, a blanket woven from rain, wind, and time. I took my notebook from my bag and opened it to the last page. The earlier notes were smudged and faded, rain-soaked memories of other seasons. On the final blank page, I wrote slowly, letting each word settle. Peace is the sound of everything listening at once. I closed the book, placed my hand against the trunk, and whispered, "I'll carry that with me." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of jasmine and soil. The branches bent slightly, as though nodding, and then the rain thickened, sudden, playful, filling the air with light and sound. I stayed for a long while, soaked and smiling, my laughter blending with the storm knot. When it finally softened, the world glowed gold again. Water dripped from every leaf like liquid sunlight. The air was warm, the earth breathing, the trees shining with quiet pride. As I walked back down the hill, I didn't look back this time. I didn't need to. The tree was no longer something I visited. It had become something I carried, in the rhythm of my breath, in the patience of my steps, in the stillness that no longer felt like emptiness. And as the rain eased behind me, I realized maybe we never truly leave the places that teach us how to listen. They keep living inside us, like roots under the skin, feeding us long after the storm has passed. The last rain of the year arrived quietly, almost like a memory returning home. It began at dusk, fine mist at first, then a steady drizzle that softened the world into watercolor. From my window, the glow of the street lamps bent through the falling drops, turning them to strings of gold. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, low and unhurried, like the heartbeat of a tired sky. I made tea and carried it to my chair by the window, the same one where all of this had begun. The cup warmed my palms. The steam carried the faint scent of jasmine and honey. I didn't open my notebook this time. I didn't need to write anything down. Some stories I'd learned aren't meant to be captured. They're meant to be lived, to drift through you like rain through leaves. The hill was barely visible beyond the mist, but I knew the old tree was there, standing, listening, unchanged in its way. Its branches had long since blended into the night, but the thought of it was enough, like remembering someone's face by heart, even when you can no longer see them clearly. As the rain deepened, I leaned back and closed my eyes. The sound filled every corner of the room, the window's soft tapping, the hush of water sliding down the roof, the steady rhythm of drops finding the earth. It was the same song that had followed me through every season, yet it never felt the same twice. I thought about all the visits, all the quiet conversations beneath that canopy of green, about the words that were never spoken but always heard. And then I thought of the whisper I'd once been afraid to believe, that even storms can be kind. It was true. The tree had never promised me calm skies. It had only promised presence, to listen, to hold, to remind me that nothing endures by resisting the storm, only by softening into it. Outside, the thunder rolled again, distant and deep. I took a slow sip of tea and smiled. The warmth spread through me, unhurried, the way the rain had learned to move through my life, gentle, inevitable, forgiving. My reflection shimmered faintly on the glass. I hardly recognized the face anymore, not because it had changed, but because it had quieted. The eyes no longer searched the distance. They rested. The lines around the mouth had softened into something peaceful. It was the face of someone who had learned that listening, truly listening, was its own form of prayer. I set the cup down and let the room grow dim. The lamplight flickered, echoing the pulse of the rain. Somewhere outside, a gust of wind brushed through the trees. And for just a moment, I thought I heard it, that low hum again, faint but certain, like the earth breathing beneath me. You've learned to hear, it seemed to say. Now go and be heard. My chest ached softly, not from sadness, but from gratitude. I whispered into the quiet, I will. The rain answered with a single, louder tap against the glass, as if sealing the promise. I sat there until the cup was empty, until the rain thinned into mist and the world outside turned silver. The hill faded into the dark, but I could still feel the presence of the tree, rooted in silence, stretching toward the sky. I imagined it listening not just to me, but to everything. The birds settling into nests, the distant river murmuring through stones, the breath of the wind finding its rhythm again. Maybe that was what patience really was, not waiting for the noise to stop, but finding music in the quiet that remains. When I finally rose, I turned off the lamp and stood by the open window. The rain brushed against my skin, cool and clean. I whispered into it, a goodbye that wasn't really goodbye. Thank you for teaching me how to stay and how to let go. The wind carried the words outward, across the fields, up the hill, through the branches of the tree that listened dot, and as the night folded itself around me, I felt it, that same peace that had waited through every storm. Patient as roots, soft as rain dot, the tea cooled on the table. The world exhaled. The story perhaps had ended, but the listening went on.